So good afternoon, everyone. I am Frank LaFurla. I'm the Dean of the School of Biological Sciences, and it's so wonderful to see so many of you here. And I want to extend a special welcome to each and every one of you, but especially to some of our speakers, special guests here today. So before we get started with the lecture, I just want to begin by thanking everyone in the Dean's office for all the hard work that they do, because as you can imagine, it takes a lot of effort to really put together one of these lecture series. So why don't we give them a warm round of applause and acknowledge their hard work. And so many of you know that we established this lecture series several years ago as part of our efforts to really inform the public about the importance of the living world. And many of you know that the foundational theme of the School of Biological Sciences is 3 words: mind, body, world. And the concept behind that is that for most of us, to have a healthy mind, one needs to have a healthy body. To have a healthy body, we need to have a healthy planet and a healthy world. And so it's in that spirit that we have really tried to get out the word of how important all of those components are. And that's why a sub-theme for the school is often life interconnected, because we are all interconnected on this planet. But with that, we've heard from a lot of members of the community, such as yourselves, who are very interested in supporting the school. Sadly, some of you don't have millions of dollars to donate to the school, but you want to help in different ways. And so with that, we started the BioSci Ambassadors Program. And so if you're interested in learning more about this and helping in a small way, please see either myself or any of the staff in the Dean's office, and we'd be happy to talk to you more about this. So today's topic is one that's very timely. You'll hear about it often in the news, and it's the impact of climate change. And I would argue that it's one of the global challenges that we're facing today in our society. And I would also argue as a biologist that the only reason why we really care about climate change is what it's doing to life forms. No one really cares about climate change on Mars, for example, but we really care about what it's doing to our life forms here. And in part, it's because we know that evolution cannot keep up with the rapid change that's occurring. And so with that in mind, as you sit back and discover the living world here, and you'll see our new annual report is out, and so if you haven't received it, there are a limited number of copies available, and if you're nice to me and Kathleen, we'll even autograph them for you. And with that, let me introduce our distinguished speaker today. She is no stranger to the School of Biological Sciences, and oops, sorry about that. And I guess it's weird once you become a senior professor, especially when you're so young. I know I had a hard time with that. But when we say senior, we mean distinguished. And she has accomplished a remarkable number of feats in a relatively short period of time. She's an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, has been elected to other societies as well. And I think one of the coolest and most significant accolades that she has received is that she was recently cited as the top 1% of researchers in her field. So think about the implications about that. That's pretty remarkable. She's very enthusiastic about this lecture, and she even commissioned this wonderful work of art, which I think she will describe to you in a lot more detail. And so sit back and enjoy a terrific lecture. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you. Stay here. Stay
Okay.
here. I just want to take this opportunity to say that I've worked with Frank now closely for a few years, and I could not ask for a better boss or friend. He really, you can tell when you work with him, he really cares about the people in the school and the community, and that motivates his leadership. And so I'm very glad to have worked with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I hope that you can all hear me. Let me know if that changes. First of all, I am so touched to see all of you here today. You know, I'm looking in the audience, I'm seeing so many friends. My family is here, my husband and my kids. They won't raise their hands because they're embarrassed. My neighbors have been great. My lab members, grad students, colleagues who are friends. WAVE members, the women of WAVE, been wonderful to work with. Twitter friends, I see some Twitter friends in here. I get to meet in person. And then also, members of the media who have been very helpful. So thank you so much, all of you. I think it's no secret that I've had an eventful couple of years. I will say that having the support of all of you, everybody here, and even more people who are not here, has given me the strength and the courage to make the right decisions, to be a better advocate for our students. And so I just want to take this chance to acknowledge, thank you all so much for making me a better person, and I hope helping make UCI a better place to be. So thank you all for being here and your support. Okay, so now I'm going to start my lecture. I'm going to start with something called a territorial acknowledgement. And this is something that a number of faculty in my department have pledged to do at the start of our talks. And it's a way to highlight indigenous people in the area. Okay, so we're standing in land of the Tonga Nation. Even though the Irvine Company sold this land to UCI, the Tonga Nation is still here and part of the community. I also want to acknowledge the UCI American Indian Student Association, which is a strong advocate for environmental awareness here. They say that no matter who legally owns the land, the water and the air will always belong to the people. And I will also say as an ecologist that the water and the air belong to the animals and the plants as well, and the microbiome. All right, so when I talk about the microbiome, I'm simply talking about the collection of microbes in a certain area. So that includes bacteria and fungi and other things. All right. Now, my title, Catching Your Breath. I'm not actually talking about you catching your breath. I'm talking about the microbiome catching your breath. So every time you inhale, you breathe in microbes like fungi and bacteria. And you're doing it now. There's no cause for concern. You've been doing this all your life. Most microbes are perfectly fine to inhale. And some of them are beneficial, and we actually need them. But it's important to understand the microbiome because they're a part of us. We're human beings with microbes around us and on us and inside of us. So by learning more about the microbiome, we learn more about ourselves. Now, and knowledge is power. Now, I'm going to introduce you to some of the people who have helped generate this knowledge. These are the collaborators who've worked on the research I'm going to be telling you about today. I especially want to highlight Morgan Goris and Linon Kat. They are PhD students here at UCI, and they have led the research that I'm going to be telling you about as part of their PhD dissertations. Linon Kat is a PhD student in my lab, and Morgan Goris is a PhD student in Jim Randerson's lab and Charlie Zender's lab. And they're really superstars. It's been wonderful to work with them. Okay. Now I'm going to tell you why we go to so much effort to study the microbiome. It's to help people like Eric Fukami here. So Eric Fukami, earlier this year, checked himself into a hospital in Fresno, California. And he had severe flu-like symptoms. He thought he'd be there for a couple of days. It turns out, once he was in the hospital, his condition worsened rapidly. He ended up having to be put on a heart and lung machine. And it turned out that he had a severe case of valley fever. And valley fever is a disease caused by a fungus. Right? He had to be in the hospital. He was on a heart and lung machine for 24 days, and he was in the hospital for a total of 2 months. Now, he's out and he's feeling better, but he said of his experience, if I were to see a loved one in that kind of state, I'd probably lose it. And I definitely feel the same way, and I'm sure that many of you do too. Now, I have a question for the audience. If you feel comfortable sharing, would you mind please raising your hand if you know someone who has or has had valley fever? All right, okay, so a few people. All right, this is a disease that is becoming more and more common in the Southwest. Now, the best description I can give to you of this disease is that it's basically fungal pneumonia. People who get it, they get fever, coughing, chest pains, and shortness of breath. Now, most people can get better on their own, but about 40% of people actually end up in the hospital. So this is a tough disease. And again, it's caused by fungi. All right, now, I want to take a minute and say I don't want to give fungi a bad reputation, okay? I love fungi. And there are millions of species of fungi. Only a few hundred of them cause disease for us. Only a few. Most of them are great, and I love them. So a lot of people think of fungi as mushrooms, and it's true. Some fungal species make mushrooms, and they can be quite beautiful, and some of them can be quite tasty. Other types of fungi are very important for us to live. That's because they form beneficial relationships with plants, including our crop plants. They help our plants grow better, and they help the food be more nutritious. So we need them. And then also, did you know that yeast are fungi? Right? We use them to make bread, wine, and beer. Those are the things that make life worth living. So I'm a big fan of these fungi. Okay. Now, of course, some of them cause disease, like this blight on this corn plant here. And I'm going to be talking about this blight a little bit later on in the talk. Now, some people have asked me if fungi are plants. No, they're not plants. They have their own kingdom. In fact, they're most closely related to animals. But they differ from animals in an important way in that they can't walk around. But fungi do need to be able to move, especially the ones that cause disease. So you can imagine this fungus had to get to this corn plant somehow. All right. So instead of walking, fungi use spores. Use spores to get around. Okay. We can think of spores as kind of seed-like structures. They float through the air. They're very aerodynamic. They're small. And where they land, then a fungus can grow. Now, these spores can travel quite a ways on the wind. They can travel for miles. And some of them have even crossed oceans. Now, they get everywhere. So we see them even in the upper reaches of the atmosphere, and they're certainly in this room. Again, that's no cause for alarm. And this mushroom is obviously making a lot of spores here. And in fact, this mushroom made the music that was playing when you came into the room. All right. So this is an art installation by Jan Sesnick and Patrick Hickey. They shined a laser onto the spores coming out of this mushroom. They assigned notes to the spores based on how big they were and how fast they fell. And that's making this music. They think it's probably the first piece of music composed by fungi. All right, so in these last two examples, I've shown mushrooms releasing spores. But fungi can use lots and lots of different ways to make spores and move around. And one fungus that is particularly good at using spores to move around is Coccidioides. Coccidioides is the fungus that causes valley fever. Now, I'm not going to call it Coccidioides anymore in this talk because that's quite a mouthful. I'm just going to call it the valley fever fungus. All right, so this fungus makes spores, not in mushrooms, but in these thread-like hyphae here. And these kind of blue square structures are the spores. They're very, very small, even as far as spores go. You can line up 10 of them across, and they could barely make it across a human hair. Right? So these fungi make these spores, but only under certain conditions. Most of the time, these fungi are minding their own business, right? They're growing in the soil in parts of the Southwest. And for the most part, they're doing their thing. When there's a drought, or the soil dries up for another reason, they start making these spores. Right? Now, when the soil dries up, what happens too is that the soil gets more crumbly. And so as prevailing winds pass over the soil, they'll scour the soil and pick up those particles. Now, when the fungi are making those spores, the winds will pick up the particles as well. And they'll travel pretty far. And sometimes a human will breathe them in. Now, these spores are so small that they get really deep into people's lungs, and they'll grow there, and that's what causes the disease. So I want to emphasize, valley fever is caused by people breathing in fungal spores of this particular species from the environment. It's not contagious. We don't pass it from person to person. We only get it from the environment. And because we get it from the environment, that means that the environment can control the spread of valley fever. And in fact, climate change can control many aspects of the valley fever life cycle. So it determines how well the fungus grows in the soil in the first place. It controls whether the fungus makes spores during a drought. And it also controls whether those spores are picked up in windstorms. Each of these things is changing with climate change. Now, something that's changing is that we're getting more dust storms in the Southwest, like this one. All right, that's simply because the soils are drying up more. We're getting more drought as a result of climate change. More dust can be picked up. These dust storms are particularly common in the southern Arizona, and this is in Phoenix, Arizona. They're also common in the Central Valley. We're seeing more and more of them. Now, when people have taken dust from these storms and looked for this fungus that causes valley fever, they've found it. So these dust storms can carry these spores of valley fever. And in fact, one of the best predictors of valley fever outbreaks is searching on Twitter for the use of the phrase dust storm. When there's a peak in that phrase in a certain area, we'll then find often a peak in valley fever shortly after that. The people were breathing those spores. Okay, so we have some ideas from the ecology of this fungus that climate change could influence the spread of valley fever. But when we first started working on this question, we didn't know for sure. So this brought us to our central question. Right? Could climate change expose more places to valley fever and other fungal diseases? Right? Now, this is a very daunting question to ask, but it's important. If we understand how climate change could be linked to these diseases, we can then predict their spread in the future. And knowledge is power, and we can potentially either intervene early in outbreaks or even prevent infections from happening. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about climate change. So climate change is real, of course, it's happening now. This is a graphic showing the progression of global warming, starting in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution up till recent years. The warmer the color, the warmer the temperature on the globe. You can see here that when we start hitting the 70s, global warming starts progressing very rapidly, especially in the 80s, okay, 90s, this century, all right. And this is the latest interval. Okay. So climate change, you can see, it's easy to see. And it's happening worldwide, including Southern California. Now, if you think you've noticed the weather changing over the years, you're not imagining it. It's been changing. In fact, this last drought that we had, the 4-year-long drought that was very severe, it was the most severe drought we've had in the past 500 years. Right? That is climate change. And again, we're expecting more droughts in the future because of this. All right, and climate change is a global phenomenon, but it's not like it's happening far away and we don't need to worry about it. Climate change is affecting us right here in Orange County right now. This right here is a map of Orange County. You see UCI here. The state of California has designated certain neighborhoods in Orange County as being environmental justice communities. This means that these communities are right now experiencing deleterious health effects from the environment, in most cases pollution. Now, these communities can also potentially be very vulnerable to climate change in the future. So I just want to emphasize that as we do our work here at UCI, we keep in mind our neighbors and what they need. And we really try to make sure that the work we do is useful to them and that we get the knowledge to them that they want and they need, including how this fungus might spread. I feel like it's a moral requirement for our work. Okay, so where is valley fever right now? This is a map from the CDC of their educated guesses about valley fever hotspots. The darker the green, the more risk there is of someone catching valley fever. And you can see here, there are 2 hotspots right now in Arizona and Central Valley. This is where we get a lot of dust storms. Now, you may be looking at Orange County. If I were you, I would. It's designated lower risk right now. This means that the CDC thinks the fungus is out there, it's in the soil. We haven't seen any outbreaks yet. Now, again, these are the current hotspots for valley fever. The question is, with climate change, would these hotspots either expand or move? Now, people who've been studying valley fever have for some time now suspected that climate change could be influencing its spread. And that's mostly because valley fever cases have risen pretty rapidly in the past 2 decades. So I'm just going to give you a picture of this. So back in 2000, in the US, we had 2,700 cases of valley fever. And each icon here represents 100 of those cases. Jumping ahead to 2008, we had 7,100 cases. And then last year, we have 14,000 cases. This is a dramatic rise. Now, I want to remind you again, this is not contagious. This rise is not being caused by being passed from person to person. Each one of these cases is from breathing in the dust. And I also want to mention, it's not because the human population is increasing that we're seeing more cases. The human population is not increasing this fast. Okay, so back in 2011, the CDC issued a notice that valley fever had become a silent epidemic in the Southwest. And they called it silent because not many people had heard about it. But that's been changing. Right? There's been more media coverage of this disease. And these are just headlines from the past year. This one on top really caught my attention. New data shows valley fever has leaped in Ventura County and throughout California. Right? In this article, they said that Ventura County used to have just a handful of cases a year, but now they're getting hundreds. Okay. I am concerned about that because Ventura County is just over the mountains from LA. Right? LA, the greater LA area has about 20 million people in it. Right? If valley fever hotspots start moving into the LA area, even if only a small percentage of people get it, that would still add up to quite a few people. And we would like to know about that. We would like to be forewarned. Okay, so when we started working on this question, we asked ourselves, first of all, it looks like there might be a link between climate and valley fever. We need to really rigorously test this out. So we asked, how might climate currently control valley fever? Now, we had weather records from the past 20 years in this area, and then we also could get valley fever cases. So our objective was to look for a relationship between those two. If we found a relationship, then we could use that to try to predict future cases as climate change progresses. So Morgan and Lennon set a goal for themselves. They wanted to get the most detailed valley fever cases that they could get for data. They decided they wanted to focus on these 5 states. They wanted valley fever case numbers for each county in those states for each month going back for as many years as they could. Once they got that data, it was detailed enough that they could then compare it to climate. So Linon and Morgan, at the time, there was no central database for this. So Linon and Morgan just wrote to the regional health agencies in these areas. And you can imagine that they're busy. And so it took a lot of effort, a lot of persistence, a lot of patience. But Morgan and Linon were able to get valley fever case numbers for every county, for every month, for the years spanning 2000 to 2015. It was a lot of work. Now, I want to emphasize, we didn't ask for any patient identification or details or anything like that. We just asked for the case numbers. This is just a summary of the data that they got. This is showing you the number of cases per 100,000 people. Darker colored red indicates more cases. County by county, this is per year averaged across these 15 years. Right, so you can see these hot spots lighting up that I've been talking about. Okay, so now after they had this, Morgan got her weather data from the same time in these same counties and started looking for relationships between these numbers. And she found them. She found that there was a relationship between climate and valley fever cases. Now, what surprised us is that we thought there'd be a very complicated relationship, that we expected different things to be important at different times. But it turned out there were two fairly straightforward rules of thumb that determined whether a county became a hotspot. And that was basically hot, dry conditions were key. And specifically, if a county had temperatures that were warmer than 51 degrees Fahrenheit, that's averaged year-round, and they had less rain than 24 inches of rain each year, then you would see them light up as a hotspot for that year. Now, I want to emphasize that I know that 51 degrees Fahrenheit does not sound very warm, but that's the average year-round. That includes winter temperatures. So I just wanted to show you what a place looks like with this kind of weather profile. It's kind of a desert-like place, right? Hot and dry. Okay, so once Morgan found this relationship, then she could see whether, I just want to mention, as climate change progresses, more and more areas are going to start meeting these criteria, right? We're expecting drier conditions and warmer conditions. So Morgan wanted to know where those conditions would change and how fast. Okay. So she asked, how might future climate control valley fever? So what she did was she used an advanced computer simulation called an Earth system model. So an Earth system model is basically the Earth in a computer. And people, like in Earth system science here at UCI and other places, they'll make Earth system models by including what they know about how the Earth works. So they simulate how oceans work, how the land works, how the atmosphere works. I see somebody put fungi in there. I'm very happy about that. And then they simulate adding greenhouse gases from human activity. And then they can watch how climate change progresses. Now, if you happen to have seen stories in the news that are predicting how the climate will look in the future, chances are those stories came from computer simulations like this one. Okay, in this case, Morgan could use it to predict where valley fever would move. Okay, so the first thing that she did with her model is she had to test it to see how well it worked. So she checked to see whether she could reproduce past patterns of valley fever cases. So this is a reproduction from the computer simulation of valley fever cases for 2007. And it actually matched the pattern, the real pattern, pretty well. Not perfectly, but pretty close. So once she established that this prediction worked well, she then moved into the future to simulate climate change. Okay, so where should these cases move? In 2035, we expect valley fever to become more abundant. It's moving northward. Right, that's not too long from now. What about the end of this century? All right, well, by the end of the century, we actually expect the valley fever will not be a southwestern disease anymore. It'll be more like a western disease. All right, much of the plains states here will be exposed to valley fever, and they haven't been before. And that's something that we really needed to know about. Now, if I were you, and I'm looking at Orange County right here. So Orange County has some of the darker colors. It will have a fairly high incidence rate of valley fever, and it'll be a hot spot. Right? So that's the end of the century, so it's okay. We have plenty of warning, This is not necessarily good news, I realize. But knowledge is power. We know about it now. And it helps to have an early warning system. Now we know we can take steps to intervene as this fungus moves and help prevent negative effects of this disease. Okay. And we came up with some kind of low-hanging fruit for recommendations for policymakers. What can people do to help deal with this in a kind of cheap way right now? First of all, we recommend having early alerts for doctors in these new areas that valley fever should move into. And that will aid in diagnoses. And in fact, we could even look at the area of a county in a certain year and say, oh, we think valley fever is going to be bad this year. Be on the lookout for it in your patients. And this is really important because valley fever is often misdiagnosed at first. And that delays the treatment, and then the disease gets worse. The second thing that we recommend is monitoring valley fever in the plain states. Now, CDC requires certain states to report valley fever cases to them. They don't require all the plain states to do it right now. We suggest that they do that. That way, CDC can keep track of it, and early on, they can start alerting the plain states if valley fever is moving in. Finally, we recommend having health advisories for outdoor workers. These are the people who are going to be affected by valley fever. They deserve to know about it. Farm laborers tend to get it. Wildland firefighters and construction workers. They're out there in these dusty areas. They're breathing the dust. And we emphasize we should have multiple languages in these health advisories because these communities don't necessarily have English as their first language. We need to get them the information in an easy way. Now, we'll put in these health advisories what I would tell you. If you go into a valley fever hotspot, if you see a dust storm like the one I showed you earlier, go inside. Go inside, get in your car, go in your house, avoid that dust storm. Right? If you're working in your garden and you're making some dust, water down the soil. If you are near a construction site that's making a lot of dust, call the city. They're supposed to water down the soil so they're not making the dust. And I want to emphasize right now, we're in a low-risk area right now. It's just if you travel to a hotspot. Those are my recommendations for you. Now, I've been talking a lot about valley fever in the US, but I want to remind you, spores are long-winded. They can go for miles. And the hotspots we're predicting are right along the Mexican-US border. So it's possible that they could move across. Now, this right here is a global wind map from a random day in January. And you can see the winds are moving across the border. And I guarantee you, if there are valley fever spores in those winds, they are not going to respect the international border. Right? And in fact, we've had outbreaks on both sides of this border. So it's very important as we work on solutions for managing this problem to include researchers from both countries. They both deserve a seat at the table. And we've been really lucky, actually. We've been working with researchers in Mexico who have literally offered us a seat at the table. This right here, the woman in the red here, is Dr. Marichel Riquelme, and she's an international expert on the valley fever fungus. And I contacted her earlier on in our research, and she invited us down to her lab in Ensenada in Baja California. She shared her protocols with us. She even took us to former valley fever hotspots. That was not fun, but we went. And we had a great collaboration, and we ended up working on this policy paper together that Linon led. It's called Crossing the Line, Human Disease and Climate Change Across Borders. And in it, we made specific recommendations for researchers, for best practices, for sharing information about this disease and how to inform health agencies on both sides of the border so that we can work together on this problem. Okay, so far I've been focusing on valley fever, which is a disease that affects humans. But we're not the only ones who breathe. Plants breathe as well. Right? They breathe when they photosynthesize. And they can breathe in fungal spores too. And there are fungal diseases that infect plants, including crop plants. And this is not a trivial problem. Every year, fungal diseases reduce crop plant yields by enough food to feed 1 billion people. Enough food for 1 billion people is lost each year from fungal diseases. And this is an issue here in Southern California because we're an agricultural center. So we also wanted to use the same approaches that we use for valley fever to check to see if food crop diseases would change in the future. In this case, we went right to the source. And Morgan and Lynn and Kat took a very, very long road trip across the Southwest to collect samples. They stopped every 60 miles in this road trip across like 7 states. And they collected soil from each site they stopped at, and they collected dust from the air. And they used a vacuum pump here that pulled air through a filter, and the spores and dust landed on the filter. Okay, so they took this material back to the lab, extracted the DNA from the samples, sequenced it, and used like a barcoding technique to identify the species, all the species of fungi in those samples, in every site, all across the Southwest. That way, we could map where all these fungal diseases were. And I'll show you just one example of a fungal disease we mapped. This is Fusarium head blight. It was one of the most common diseases we found. This is a disease that infects cereal crop plants, shown right here. It's a current concern. Back in the year 2000, there was an outbreak in the Midwest that caused $2.7 billion worth of crop losses. All right, and Lynn was able to map where this fungus was from her samples. So this should show you, this is the map of the road trip that they took. Each spot here is a site they stopped at. The redder the color, the more abundant this disease was in their samples. Now, what you can see here, just looking, is that this disease, this fungal disease, tended to be more common up in the north. And if you look to see where the green areas are, that's kind of the mountains. It was more common in the mountain regions, like higher elevations. So when Lynn took all the climate data she had for this region and checked for relationships between this abundance and the climate data, what happened was she found a very nice relationship just between temperature and the abundance of this disease. And this disease actually seems to prefer cooler temperatures. Right? Now, what's useful there is we think that's good news. Right? So as climate is changing and temperatures are getting warmer, this fungus might not be able to tolerate those warmer temperatures very well. So we might experience less of this crop disease. Right? So some good news for a change. Right? So we're getting this information about diseases that affect humans and crop plants, and we know we want to share it. This is important to share to people who can help. And so one of the things that we do in our lab is we make an extra effort to communicate with elected officials. And Lynn actually was inspired. She took internships in Washington, D.C. for 2 summers. She's there right now. And she is talking about her research findings to elected officials there. And here's a picture of her at an exhibit on food security in Capitol Hill last June. And I also feel very strongly about this. I have come to an uncomfortable realization the past few years. I discovered that if I find something that's important for people to know about, it's not enough for me to publish it in a journal article. Right? I need to actually usher that information to the people who can help. I need to make sure that happens. And so I've been working very hard to reach out to different elected officials. And I want to say I'm very happy that we have representatives of US Congresswoman Katie Porter here, State Assemblywoman Kati Petrie-Norris here. I think Chris Murray's here. She's a former city council member of Anaheim. And I think also somebody from Congressman Harley Ruda's office as well. So I'm so glad that you're here, and I just want to reiterate my commitment to communicating with elected officials. We want to be sure that we share this knowledge to help people. Okay, so I want to leave plenty of time for questions. Do I have time for questions? Okay, so I am going to summarize here, right? So for my last gasp here in this talk, I just want to emphasize that we have uncovered some linkages between fungal diseases and climate change. We found good news and bad news. The bad news is that valley fever may extend to new states in the future and may become more of a hot spot here. And the good news is that a common crop pest, Fusarium head blight, may actually become less of a problem. All right, we're sharing this knowledge with the people who can help and the people who will be most affected. And in summary, I just want to say that learning about the microbiome helps us deal with climate change because knowledge is power. All right, thank you very much. Okay. What?
That was amazing.
Thank you. Did my best.
So, real tour de force, Kathleen. Excellent. So we have time for questions from people in the audience, and I think we'll have microphones that'll circulate out. But I'll ask the first question while we're waiting, I guess, and that is that I don't think we can be too close because of feedback. But your work is obviously very important because you said it gives us a chance to plan in advance.
Right.
Is this stimulating any work on antifungal agents, for example?
Right. So there's a lot of work that's happening right now to find a vaccine for valley fever. There's been especially some great advances in the University of Arizona. They've had some good clinical trials with rats, I believe. And so it's very, very promising. And so that is something that we really encourage. And it could be very helpful if a vaccine is developed. If we know about these outbreaks happening early on, then we can make sure we ship the vaccine to those places. Yeah.
Kathleen, that was an outstanding talk, and I really commend you for conveying some difficult information very, very, very well. I have two related questions. Can valley fever infect domestic animals? And in terms of the human population, are there more people that might be more susceptible to infection than others?
Yeah. So valley fever, unfortunately, can infect a lot of mammals. It infects dogs, and it's often fatal in dogs. It's really awful. It's infected the gorilla at the LA Zoo. It's infected sea lions who have, when there's been winds blowing the dust into the ocean, when they come up to breathe, they breathe it in, they get valley fever. So it's a widespread problem. Now, remind me of your second question. Oh yeah, so certain populations are especially susceptible to valley fever. This includes Hispanic people and African Americans, people with suppressed immune systems, people in their third trimester of pregnancy. And so that is something that's very important to consider because often these areas where we're starting to see these outbreaks will have people in these vulnerable communities more common there, right? So that's an additional layer it's very important to consider. Part of environmental justice. Yeah.
Maybe we have one on the right side there.
Yeah.
When new construction is being planned, highways, buildings, housing developments, where they're going to be breaking ground, is there any way to go out and do a rapid test to find out if the soil in that particular area is at particular high risk?
Yes, there is a way. So we could do the same thing that we did in our Southwestern trip. We can go out and collect dust and soil samples. And people are doing that. If there's construction in areas like around Fresno where they know there are particularly infected areas, then sometimes the companies will pay to have those surveys done. But it's voluntary right now. And actually, there was just a big lawsuit that was settled about the construction of a highway up in Northern California where there was an outbreak. There was a lot of fungi growing in this one area where they were making the highway, and a lot of the workers got sick. And so the workers sued because there hadn't been that test done ahead of time. So I think that is a very good idea.
Yes, can you help me understand? It's hot, dry conditions that help the spores start and spread, but
Right.
yet it infects your lungs, which is a really hot, wet area, and they grow there. Can you help me?
Yeah, I know. Fungi are just so odd. So this fungus actually has two forms. So it has this, thread-like, it makes these thread-like hyphae in the soil, and it can live its whole life without ever being around an animal. Then if it's inhaled and brought in, it changes its form. It takes more of a yeast form, where it's unicellular, and it has an entirely different environmental envelope. It's just remarkable. There's a bunch of fungi that are like that. Yeah.
I have two questions. The first is, other than the vaccine you talk about, is there any other way to prevent the disease, such as, does wearing a mask help?
Yeah.
My second question is about, I'm from Arizona. I thought only Phoenix has valley fever.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. And, my question is, I heard when I was in Phoenix, the valley fever doesn't always just impact your lung, it always can impact your brain. Is that right?
It's bad. Yeah, it's a really bad thing. So I'll answer the last question first. So in most cases, it just infects the lung. But sometimes, if it takes a while to get diagnosed and it progresses, then the fungus can spread to other parts of your body. It's awful. And if it infects your brain, then that's often fatal. Sometimes people will get their legs infected and they have to have their legs amputated. It's really awful, really awful. Okay, and then, you're asking how can you prevent it? So that's germane right now. So I was hoping that you could just wear one of those masks that you can buy. No, those spores are so small, you basically have to have like a biohazard suit on to get rid of it. So, or like a full-on face mask with very advanced filters. So, oh man, I wish it were easier. I was driving through the Central Valley because I was visiting UC Merced, and I had to drive through a bunch of dust storms, and I was holding my breath the whole time. I knew. It was awful.
You could buy a Tesla because they have a biohazard feature.
I will do that.
We have one in the back.
Do you see a correlation with outbreaks in like cotton farming and tillage in the area?
Yeah, I think that we checked for a correlation. Where is Morgan? I'm so sorry. She's the one who checked. Can I put you on the spot? Is there a relationship between agricultural activity?
A little bit of a relationship. Counties that had larger amounts of agricultural area did tend to have higher amounts of valley fever, but it wasn't as strong as the climate controls.
Yeah, so just something to think about. Yeah.
I think Lee has
Thank you, Morgan. Okay.
Hi, Kathleen. Great talk.
Thank you.
As the climate continues to warm, what other diseases do we need to worry about? Asthma, for example?
Yeah, I mean, there are many. And, well, in other parts of the world, malaria is really a problem. It's spreading. You used to find malaria mostly in the lowlands in like Kenya, and now it's moving up the mountain. And Guizhan Yan, who's a faculty member here at UCI, is studying how malaria is changing with climate change. Yellow fever could be an issue. People are concerned about it in Mexico City. Mexico City, from what I understand, is relatively high elevation. Yellow fever is kind of at the lower elevation. It prefers the warmer temperatures, but it's coming on up. And if it hits the city, that's a lot of people. So there are a number of ones that we're looking at. And Morgan, I think, is working on the West Nile virus, right? She's working on the West Nile virus. So we're keeping an eye on these things. Yeah.
Kathleen, sadly, politicians don't seem to understand science, and some of them even don't believe that there's such a thing as a fact. So convincing them about the science can be tough.
Right.
But presumably there's a massive financial impact of some of this stuff. And I wonder, have you looked at that and tried to convince politicians to do something from that perspective? And I'm also wondering, is California leading the way in this to try and at least affect California's climate and California's population?
Yeah, so that's a good point. I will say, I want to make sure that I say that our representatives right now are amazing, and they totally do believe in science. And they call me up, like Katie calls me up, Katie Porter calls me up to ask me about things. So that is wonderful. So present company accepted. But I think we all can think of politicians who do not believe in science. So we do use the numbers. And so, and Linon, she had that exhibit at the food security place. She had the fact sheets. A lot of it was based on the economics. So that can be very helpful. And yeah, I think California is leading the way. I mean, we lead the way in most everything related to the environment or climate change. I'm so proud about that. And so there are many different ways that the state government is funding this kind of work, especially just funding the research.
So Kathleen, can you unpackage a little bit what you said earlier? There are a lot of young researchers here. Can you, help us to get a better understanding of how you first made these contacts with the politicians and others to really play such a big role in getting your research more publicized?
Oh, yeah. I just, well, at first, our previous representative was Mimi Walters. And I worked so hard with so many of the faculty who are here. We contacted her office. We'd go in, we'd meet with the staff. We just asked to meet with her. We wanted to meet with her to tell her about our work. She just would not meet with us. We never got a chance to meet with her. So that was frustrating. But that was kind of about the time that the election was happening. So we started working with the candidates. And so I got to know a lot of the candidates. Katie Porter is my neighbor. She lives around the corner from me. And so I worked with them while they were running. And then once they went into office, then that was an easy relationship to maintain. But also, I just reach out. You can go to meetings in these representatives' offices. You can walk in and request a meeting. The city council members, like Irvine City Council, they're very accessible. You can go into a city council meeting and speak, and I have. Anybody can speak for 3 minutes. So you go in and speak and tell them about your work. They have to listen to you. They're standing right there. And so it just builds up over time. It just builds up over time. It takes a while. Oh, yeah. Say hi.
Hi, my name is Jose Castaneda, and my question is, you mentioned a little bit about Twitter searches in order to find the, correlation between the valley fever incidences and dust storms. Yeah. Are there any other hashtags or phrases that students could look to try to dig out and unpeel these relationships? Yeah, I mean, you can look for just about any disease. You can look for mentions of that disease or the things that lead to it on Twitter. It's really amazing, and you can see exactly which regions those tweets are made from. And so it was actually very useful for Mexico. So for Mexico, the health agencies don't keep a centralized database for valley fever. We'd have to contact every single hospital to find valley fever cases. But I could actually look for tweets from Mexico that use the term dust storm. And I could get an idea of where things were happening there. And so it can be very useful in areas, just a way of kind of finding alternate ways to get data. Yeah. Thank you.
So it's been said that one of the best defenses that Mother Nature ever developed was winter.
Yeah.
And we're seeing spreads of insects into areas and now fungi. And so I think your talk really illuminated a lot of us here. So Kathleen is not only an outstanding researcher and teacher, but as you can hear, she's a wonderful activist and a hero to many of us. And so we want to, on behalf of the school, give her a little token of appreciation.
Appreciate that. Thank you.